Good morning, I'm Krista Campbell. Thank you for joining us today for our third and final webinar in the Insights for ArcGIS webinar series, Digging Deep into Data Analytics. My colleagues, Derek Lorbecki and Matt Kennedy, will be discussing data today and how it is used within Insights for ArcGIS, how to publish and use data sources, how to pull in public data, how to use large related data sets, and how to work with CSV and Excel files. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording location. I would like to encourage you to post your questions during the webinar. We will have time at the end to answer some of them, and the questions that we don't get to will be included in our Q&A document that will be posted on GeoNet. Also, please complete the survey at the end of the webinar. Your feedback is important to us. We do read through those surveys, so please take a minute to complete those. We're going to go ahead and let Derek start off today, and then Matt's going to jump in. So Derek?
All right, thank you, Krista. So thanks for everyone for joining us for the last of our 3 webinars. So in our first webinar, we kind of went over what Insights was and a lot of different tools and visualizations in it. In our second webinar, you looked at some customer examples and had Robert from East Valley Water District show some of those examples. So in this last webinar, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the data itself. I'm going to go over kind of how to publish data and then a couple of interesting analysis pieces through publicly available CSV files and joining large data sets together. And then Matt's going to dig real deep into how to actually massage and work with those CSV and Excel files to get them working in Insights in an optimal manner. So we'll get started here. So our agenda today is pretty straightforward. Publishing and using data sources and Insights for ArcGIS. So we're going to be looking at using some public data coming from the New York Department of Environmental Protection, looking at about 100 years of historic harbor water quality. Then we're going to look at using large related data sets. And in this instance, we're going to be looking at some information from the White House Utility District on about 10 years of consumption. And then, like I said before, Matt's going to be digging down into working with CSV and Excel files. So in all of these sessions, we've shown you data inside of Insights, but how exactly do you get that data into your organization or into a form that's able to be used inside of Insights? So the first and most easy way to do that is to publish data from ArcGIS Pro into your ArcGIS data store in your installation of Portal for ArcGIS. And to do that, it's actually very simple. So I have Pro open here, and we can see I actually have two features in here. So one of them is my service connections. That is a point feature class that has 33,000 records. And the second is a consumption table. So this is just a straight GeoDatabase table that has about 5.9 million records. Now, to actually share these, all you have to do is go up to the top here and go to Share, and Share as a web layer. When you publish this web layer out to your portal organization, it's going to copy out both the service connections and that consumption table, and it's going to place them inside of your data store. So now that data will become immediately available inside of Insights. So that's kind of the first and probably the most common way that you're going to access data inside of Insights is through your installation of ArcGIS. So, but you can also consume services that already exist in the Living Atlas and actually other services from your or other ArcGIS Online organizations. So accessing data through the Living Atlas is really simple. I've shown that a couple times. You simply just click on the Living Atlas and you have the ability to select all of these different layers. But you can also bring in data coming from other organizations or from even secured services. So let's take a look at how to do that. So the first thing I have here is an example of a public-facing service that's showing new Class 2 injection well sites in Central California. So I can very simply just copy this service endpoint, and I can add it to my ArcGIS portal organization by going Add Item from the web. Just pasting that URL in there, you'll see it's going to bring through the title from that service, and I can add a tag to it. So that's going to add my first item, so an unsecured, essentially public service. But I can also bring in secured services. So this is a secured service of main break reports coming from one of our internal ArcGIS Online organizations. And by following that exact same workflow of adding information from the web, I can copy in that service, only this time it's going to prompt me for credentials. So I'm going to type in my ArcGIS Online login information here. And it's going to allow me to actually save this secured service inside of this portal, and I'll be able to use it inside of Insights. So I have these two new services here that I've brought in from other organizations that are referencing their URLs, their REST endpoints. And now I can actually go and look at this information here, and I can bring both of these into Insights. And they behave just like any other Insights workbook would. So here's that class 3 injection site table. So I can do, what I would do with any other Insights table, looking at the map, creating tables and charts with it. And then here's that main breaks information. So go repair status. So once again, bringing in information from other sources into Insights and using it. So, really not complicated to do, and they behave just like anything else you would use in Insights. So lastly, you also have the ability to use these Excel and CSV files. And I'm just going to touch on this. Matt's going to go into much greater detail than I am. But the example I like to use of that is this New York Harbor Water Quality Database. So this is a database that goes back to 1907 and contains about 80,000 records. So I can download this database here as a CSV file. And when it comes through initially, it looks like this. So a standard comma delineated file. Now I can bring this data right into Insights. By dragging it or browsing to it in my CSV. Excuse me, I have to sneeze. Okay. But what we see initially when we bring this first set of data in is that there are definitely some issues with the data in terms of how it comes through straight from the CSV file. Some of the fields are strings, not numbers, and most importantly, when it loads here, you'll see that the X and Y fields are registered as strings and not numbers, so I can't actually enable location. So while I can use some of this data, it actually is not in the optimal format for me to use it. But I can adjust this data and use it inside of Insights fairly easily. So if we take a look at this exact same data set inside of ArcGIS Pro, I've done a little bit of massaging to it. So I've taken the information and adjusted some of these, added different aliases to them. And in the design field section of ArcGIS Pro, I've gone through and I've made adjustments to this, to changing all of my fields that are supposed to be doubles to doubles, but most importantly, taking my XY fields and making them double values so that I can actually map those out. Like I said, Matt's going to go a little bit deeper into this, but the end result of what I got is now I actually have a data set that I can use fully inside of Insights for ArcGIS. So let's dig a little bit into this public data set that I downloaded from New York DEP and see what kind of information we can glean out of it. So the very first thing I want to do with this is I want to enable the location. So by clicking on the 3 little buttons next to my data set in Insights and clicking enable location, I can select my X and my Y values, and I can very quickly enable location and make a map of this non-spatial data. So I now actually have my coordinates, and I can see where all of those test sites are, all those water sampling sites are across the greater New York City area. So I'm going to start digging into this data and looking at some of the different features of it. So the very first thing I actually think I want to look at is I want to look at information about a very common pollutant, and that is coliform cells. So I'm going to select my sample date, and I'm going to select my coliform cells. And I'm just going to create a time series chart from these. And what I immediately see from this is that the city of New York started testing for coliform in 1953, and they really kind of laid off that testing sometime in the mid 2000s and replaced it with other more intensive tests. I know that from looking at the data. But what we can see here is that there is a relatively low level, but then in the mid 1960s there's a spike and then followed by a drop off. So I want to kind of explore this data more and see if I can see if there's any reason why I would see that spike, or try to at least explain kind of what's going on with it. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to filter this data down so that I'm only looking at that range that I'm interested in. So from about 1954 to 2004. So I'm going to filter this information by my date to January 1st of 1954 till January 1st of 2004. So that's going to take us and narrow us down a little bit more on this data set so that we're only looking at the data that we are interested in. So the next thing I'm interested in looking at is to see if this spike here is related to doing more testing or anything like that. So I actually want to see the number of tests that were done per year for coliform over this time period. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my coliform sample field, and I'm going to change it to a string so I can just look at the raw number of samples that were collected for each year. So I have my string of my coliform, and now I have my year value. The very first thing that I'm going to see here is that 12,000 of these records have essentially no data in them, which means they're a point that has a test for that year but has no coliform test. So I know I can get rid of those. I also want to make sure that I'm not excluding any data. So we can see that there are a very, very low number of tests that came back with a 0 value. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to go into my coliform, and I'm going to change this back to a number. And I'm going to filter this so that we're only looking at records where there was at least one coliform cell identified. So this is going to get rid of all of those no data values. So now I'm actually able to take my samples by year, since I have it nailed down to those samples that have tests for coliform in these years, and I can actually take a look at the breakdown of my year-by-year number of tests for fecal coliform. I'll change this visualization so we can see it a little bit easier. And what I actually see is that in the mid-1960s, where we see this spike in coliform cells, there actually was no increase in testing. So this looks like this is an actual valid result of an increase in coliform over this time. I also see something very interesting, that starting in the late 1970s, not only do we see a dramatic increase in the number of samples, but a decrease in the results of those samples. So I'm going to dig just a little bit deeper into this data to see if I can figure out if there was a change in the time that they were doing these samples, but also kind of to explore what months have those highest number of coliform cells. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the month here and take a look at it. And what I can see is that, okay, so they do most of the testing in July and August and September. But if I actually bring in my total number of coliform cells, and I go to my average, what we actually see is that October is the month that has the highest number of coliform cells. But I also see something else interesting here too, is that most of my October samples occur after 1979. So I'm starting to see a pattern here, that there was an increase in sampling after the mid-70s. We've seen a decrease in fecal coliform or in coliform after the mid-1970s. So that makes me want to dig a little bit deeper. I'm seeing an improvement here in water quality, but I'm going to look at a number of different totals. So the really nice thing about this data set from the New York DEP is that it's very large. So we actually here are tracking salinity over the course of 100 years in New York City, which doesn't really show me much. But when I start looking at things like my top dissolved oxygen, I start seeing a trend where it's relatively low, around 3 or 4, which is not high enough to sustain life. But then again, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the water quality starts improving. And then when I go down and start looking at a lot of these other values, I see that they don't actually start being tracked until the 1970s or the 1980s. What I kind of gathered from all of this is that in 1972, the Clean Water Bill was passed. So since that time, there's been a lot more data collected, and we can actually visually see the improvement in water quality in the New York City harbors since the Clean Water Bill was enacted in 1972. This is just an example of using a really, really robust data set that's available publicly for anyone to kind of look at the way the water quality has evolved in the New York City area over the last 100 years. And that all came from that CSV file that I downloaded. So let's switch gears a bit and let's actually take a look at large data sets. So this is going to be utilizing that 5 million record data set from White House Utility District that I showed in my initial example. In this instance here, we have our consumption table and we have our service connections. I'm going to connect those using my account number. So this is going to create that many-to-one relationship between the 33,000 consumption records and my 5.9 million, or my 33,000 service connections and my 5.9 million consumption records. And what I actually want to kind of focus on for this analysis is whether there's a correlation or any relationship between the number of occupants living in a location and the average amount of water consumed. So the very first thing I want to do is just take a look at my occupant numbers based off of my consumption to see if I can pull any information out of that right off the bat. So if we change up the visualization of this data and change it from a sum to an average, what we see is that there are kind of three spikes. The first one of a 99 I'm going to discount. I'm assuming that that is some type of special field indicating a group home or a business or something like that. But I want to specifically focus on my occupant number of 2, but more importantly, my occupant number of 5. It seems that homes with 5 occupants have a very high average water use per month. So the very first thing I'm going to do to kind of clean this data up is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to filter out some of these occupant numbers. So I really want to focus just on my occupant, my 5 occupant numbers. So I'm just going to select the 51,000 consumption month records that have those records for households with 5 occupants. So now that I've nailed that down, I'm actually going to look at this data on the map and start to see what information I can pull out of it. So looking at the distribution of my 5 occupant households, and maybe bringing in some other information to start seeing if I can pull any patterns or trends as to what we could use to identify where those relatively high users are going to be coming from. So these are all of my records my 51,000 records that contain consumption data from a household that has 5 occupants. And I'm going to analyze this based off of the block group. So I'm actually going to pull in information coming from the Living Atlas. In this instance, I want to use the block groups, which is the smallest geography that we have available to us inside the Living Atlas from the US Census Bureau. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to aggregate these 5-person households into my block groups. This is going to give me a count of the number of 5-person household consumption months on each block group. So I can start to see which block groups have that higher number of 5-person consumption month data on it. I'm going to change this visualization from the counts and amounts to a chloropleth map. And we can start to see that we have a couple of census blocks here that have a relatively high number of these 5-person households. So I want to dig deeper into this data and see if I can figure out any demographics that would help me pick out areas where I know that I'm going to have a higher propensity for larger households. So I'm going to do that once again by using my Enrich Data button, which you've probably seen me use a couple of times during these webinars. And in this instance, I want to look at a couple of different pieces of data. I want to look at the total population, but then I also want to look at the median age. And along with that median age, I have an inkling that these may be houses that have children in them. So I want to look at my children underneath the age of essentially 18 that reside in these households. So I've selected these 6 variables, and immediately they're going to be appended onto this data set, and I'll be able to start looking at them. So the very first thing I'm just going to look at real quick here is that median age. And what we can see is that we seem to have a lineup between this median age and these census blocks that have a large number of 5-person households. So if we actually look at these count of location and the median age, what we see is that there is a correlation, but a fairly weak correlation, that the higher the number of counts for these 5-person households, the lower the median age is. I guess it's not a very strong correlation, but it does exist, and we can see it on the map there pretty clearly. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. I'm actually going to look at those age variables to see if I can identify this down even deeper to make sure that there actually is a connection here between those two. But since they came through in breaks of 0 to 4 and then 4 to 9, I actually want to kind of move these together a little bit more to give me a little bit bigger age range to deal with. So I'm going to create a couple of new fields here. The first field I'm going to call 0 to 9. And that's going to be the addition of my 0 to 4-year-olds and my 5 to 9-year-olds. And then the second new field I'm going to create is going to be called 10 to 19. And that is going to be the sum total of my 10 to 14-year-olds and my 15 to 19-year-olds. So once I have this data set in here, I can look at it a little bit differently, and I can look at this 0 to 9-year-old group. And what I see again is that some of these areas that have the relatively high count of 5-person households also have a high number of children ages 0 to 9. So if we take a look at that data, what we actually see is a little bit stronger correlation between a high number of young children and a higher count of houses that have at least or that have 5 occupants. So the very last thing I want to do is I want to normalize this for population. So I'm going to create a ratio of this where I'm taking my 0 to 9-year-old population over my total population for that area. And creating what I'm calling my child ratio with it. So I can take this data now and look at it based off of that child ratio. And I can find the areas that have that highest child ratio. Actually, I want to change this to my counts and amounts by size. So what we see is that some of these areas that have this very high number of 5-person households also have a fairly high young child ratio to total population ratio in these areas. So I'm starting to understand that one of the good indicators for where these high consumption large person households may be are areas where I have a large number of children underneath the age of 10 that have a relatively high population. And if I actually take my location data and add it to this map, what we'll see is that this data does overlay fairly well with what we were seeing there, where there actually is a focus on these records with 5-person households inside of these areas that have relatively large numbers of children. So there I'm taking 5.9 million consumption records and breaking it down to 51,000 records where I'm looking specifically at a single occupant or a 5-occupant household to see if I can figure out where those would be so I can plan more accordingly for how to work with these people and their consumption and possibly reducing their consumption. So next, we're actually going to take a look at digging deeper into how to get some of this data populated and specifically how to adjust some of those CSVs. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to walk through some steps on how to clean up CSV files, how to get them organized properly and get them loaded into Insights. So Matt?
Thanks, Derek. All right, so just a few slides complemented with some on things that you should do to your Excel files and your CSV files before starting to work with Insights. That will save you a lot of headaches. So first of all, you need to be working with Excel version 2007 or later. And the specific formats that you can work with are XLX or CSV files. So if you just have XLS files, that's a tip that you're pre-2007 and you need to upgrade those spreadsheets to work with them. Right now, pivot tables are not supported. So you have to copy those out regular spreadsheets to bring them into it. It's always a good idea to designate tables or set up named ranges. And where we mention that is sometimes a spreadsheet will have different neighborhoods of information on it, and just take those pieces of the spreadsheet, designate them as a table or a named range. And then each of those tables or ranges will be its own data table when you bring it over to Insights for ArcGIS. And as you'll be seeing in a couple of demonstrations, you want to pay attention to lots of things like naming columns properly, naming worksheets, and just preventing generic information from getting moved over to Insights. It'll be hard to work with that data. So we'll first start off by taking a look at some don'ts when you're with Excel and CSV data. You want to remove things like aggregated values, or imagine something like a grand total. Any record and any cell that Insights reads, it will put it as a record in a data table. So grand totals can cause there to be gigantic outliers of data that doesn't really exist in the table. Calculated fields, it won't know how to interpret those. So you're going to want to copy those and paste them as hard values. Empty rows, get empty rows out of your Excel spreadsheets. It's another strong case for designating tables, because you want to, when you designate a table, only designate the cells that have data, because Insight will read the empty rows and just leave lots of blanks. We're going to talk about how to get blanks out of a spreadsheet. There's very easy ways you can do that from Excel, and that way you reduce the amount of no data values come up in your charts and your graphs and your time series. We'll show you some cases for that. And you really do not want to ignore cell formatting. A lot of times when we work with Excel, we realize that we're looking at all text, and we need to be looking at a number or a date or a percentage so that we can see something as a ratio. And if you don't specifically do cell formatting in Excel, you're probably not going to get the types of data you need when you get it over to Insights. And then think of some of the neat graphs and charts and time series that Derek was doing in his part of the demonstration. That doesn't work if you don't have the right data formats enforced from the beginning. So let's jump out and take a look at a bad spreadsheet. All right, so this would be an example spreadsheet that is not quite ready for Insights. We can see it's got some kind of formatting at the top here, a lot of empty cells. If we move through this, we can see some numeric fields, such as this budget column, the bank balance, balance. These fields right now are being represented as text, and I need to treat these as numbers. If I go to the bottom of this particular consumption field, there is a grand total right there. And again, the values, they're going to cause me problems. If we move over to the right, we're going to start to see some blanks. All right, so lots of empty cells here. We're going to want to work on that. And we're going to see some ways to deal with date fields. So right now, I can write that date field there, go to Format Cells, and show you that that is being represented as text. I can fix that by choosing date here and through to pick a format. Or I can show you another way that we can work with that once it gets over to Insights. So I'm going to show you that way and just hit cancel here for now. So working with this spreadsheet, I'm going to go to Insights. And we're going to add data, and we'll bring in that spreadsheet we were just looking at and just see what are some of the consequences of not fixing a spreadsheet before we work with it. So it's that water budget sheet. And that's something else I didn't mention when we were looking at the spreadsheet. The table name that it's adopting is what the name of the worksheet was back in Excel. I want to make sure I fix that later. But if we bring the spreadsheet in, what you're going to see if I expand sheet 1 here is we're not going to get a lot of nice usable data. All right, the columns were not the actual I needed, but just the rows from Excel. All right, every here is designated as a category. There's nothing here is categorized as a date. And if we look at the data table, just reinforce how messed up some things are here. So we can see some of that top formatting with all the empty data. Those are what my field names are supposed to be. And I can go on and show you the date fields and the grand totals and other things that are in here that are going to be a problem when I try and work with this data. All right. For example, the date field that we had in the spreadsheet is row T or column T. And something that I like to benefit from in Insights is that when it sees a true date field, it will automatically break out by its various parts. So I don't have to just look at a raw date. I want to be able to look at things by quarter, by month, by day of week, by time. And right now, with date field represented the way it is, I can't do that. All right, so we've got some bad data. Now let's get some dues for what we can do about those things. So we want to make sure that those grand totals out of there. We'll always be able to get stuff back when it gets over to the Insights side of things. We can do all those kind of tabulating and more, as Derek showed you. We want to get rid of calculated values and any kind of error. And we're going to get all of the empty stuff from the beginning, the middle, and the end. We don't want any empty information that can just kind of throw off our analyses. I'll show you how to calculate the blank cells, and we'll look at some ideas for number formatting and how we can work with that. All right, let's go ahead and look at a better spreadsheet that adheres to some of the dues. We've got one that's been a little bit fixed, and we'll do some more of the fixing. So right now, the top line, the first row, is my column headings. That's what I want those field names to be. Let's go over to that consumption field. We'll head down to the bottom, and we will delete that grand total field from this spreadsheet. Let's move further over and look at some of the blanks. In my example here, in my banking applied field, the way this data was collected is that when the investors had to supply yes, they wrote yes in, but when there was no, they just didn't do anything. And I need to actually be able to query that field for no when I do my analysis. So see a really easy way that I can populate those values when I get over to Insights. I'm going to select all the data in that field. So let me just Control-Shift up till I have it all. And we'll leave out the title there. And I'm going to go to Find and Select and expand it. I'll choose Go to Special. And one of my choices is go to the blanks in a selected range. So I want to find all those blanks. And once it selects them all, I'm going to type in a value I want to go in there. And it goes in the first value here, and I'm going to hit my Control key and Enter. And now all the blanks are populated with the notes. All right, and I can do that with other fields and maybe populate all those blanks with zeros, but you get the idea, so we can move on from that for now. Those are a few of the fixes I needed to do. Let me go ahead and save this spreadsheet. I'm still going to get back to this date, but we're going to circle back to that in a little while. So let's go back to Insights, and let's add the good spreadsheet, we'll say. So we'll go and browse for that. So there's the fixed version of it. And we'll add that in. And so right off the bat, we can see that we've got field names now. When it was numeric, such as the budget or the consumption, they're actual numerical values. In fact, if we look at the consumption on a chart, and maybe swap that to a tree map, let's see. Actually, I need to do my county and consumption. Let's try our tree map. So things start to look a little bit better there. If we look at the data table, that's looking a lot better as well. There's no empty value here. If we scroll across, we should see the blanks have been taken out of the yes and no field. Last thing I want to work with is that data, or that date field. All right, so the date, the billing date is still not a date, and one way we can fix that is from right inside of Insights. I'm going to add a field. I'll name the field maybe date build. And I'm going to go ahead and use some functions to calculate that. So I'm going to do a date value function. And I'm going to choose that text field for billing date. And run. And as I scroll across, look what happens. There's the date build. There's the entire new date field, but it's also broken out by the year, the quarter, the month, right down to the hours, minutes, and seconds if I have data that detailed. So that makes it possible now to do what Excel wants to do, which is explode those things out. Right. So if I need to look at, what does consumption look like, maybe on particular days of the week, we can drag that to a chart now. Actually see that and then use time properly from inside of Insights. All right. So those are important things you can do to clean up your information. The last part I have to go with to show you for about the next 5 minutes or so. It's a little bit more about something Derek showed you on enabling location for your tables. The two spreadsheets that I've been working with so far, there is no location field at the top. When I look at these icons like the chart or the sigma or the clock, I'm looking for another type of location symbol that I don't have with this table. So what I want to do with that is leverage what's in my spreadsheets. All right, this spreadsheet has address information in it, a city, state, zip. It's also got, let's scroll over too far there, XY coordinates. So if you have some or all of that stuff in your spreadsheets, you can use it to build in locations. And a little bit of tip on that is, to make your Excel and your CSV files spatial, you can leverage coordinates that might live in that spreadsheet. Today, you can use WGIS 84, or you can use Web Mercator as coordinates. Other systems are coming soon. If you want to use addresses, you can use Esri's World Geographic Locator, or you can use your own address. And we do support single or multiple address fields. And the third way that you can enable location is based off of geographies. So you can bring other zones or grid or districts into your workbooks and use those to spatialize your Excel sheets. And we can even see an example of when and why you might enable multiple locations. So let's go look at that and see what that's all about. Let's go to Insights. And we're going to add one more table. So we'll add data. And let's find one more spreadsheet. And we'll bring that in. And I'm going to enable location on these fields in two ways. We'll do it the first time based on the address. So I just have to choose well, I'll do coordinates. We'll skip the address, but let's do coordinates. It's already found the X and Y locations, and we can hit run. And now the data has that new symbol I'm looking for. So that's the first way that I've represented location here. And maybe I want to look at the location and the let's do. So let's drag that to a map. And that's something else we noticed is I can even make maps now. So I have a location field. I'm in business. And we can look at that now spatially, not just tabularly. Now, I want to enable location again on that same data. Let me show you what you can do when you carry something like that out. This time, I'm going to use a geography. And I've already brought in some geographies that were available from the Living Atlas. You can see the zip codes here for the USA. And where I got those is by adding data and then going to boundaries. And I can choose all of the boundaries. I can bring it all in, or what I did was just bring in the zip codes, just bring in the one I needed. But you know, watch what happens when I enable location based on a geography. We'll enable that location, pick geography, the field that we want, and the layer to aggregate that against, and we'll run it. We will see a second location field, and now what it's going to let me do is let's look at patches owed per zip code. All right, so different geography, we can make that, and maybe we even run a quick new legend. It would make more sense just by All right. So make sure that you're leveraging those capabilities. You don't have to just use points on a map. You can also use these kinds of aggregations when you enable your locations. And then the last thing I have to talk about, and then I'll pass it back to Kristen and Derek, is just some final considerations. Every table or named range or worksheet becomes its own table in Insights. If you have multiple sheets and CSV files, you're going to want to copy those to their own separate CSVs or just copy them to Excel themselves. When you share your workbooks, the Excel data will go along with them, so that's a handy feature. And just be advised that unlike some other sets that might come out of your organization, things that you drag and drop in from Excel and CSV are not going to refresh automatically. So if you get new versions of some kind of data from Excel, you need to manually load those back into your workbooks and update your analyses. But that's all to tell you about some tips and tricks for successfully working with Excel data in Insights, and hopefully hitting the ground running as quickly as possible with your Excel-based data.
Thanks, Matt. I believe we're going to go to our questions and answers now. So we have several questions that were coming in while you were presenting, as well as Derek. So let's just start off with a common question that we also received during the first two webinars is, how is Insights for ArcGIS implemented? Can it be used with ArcGIS Online? Do you have to have ArcGIS Portal? Can you guys discuss that and give our attendees some information along those lines?
Yeah, so I'll start with that second piece or the first piece first. Insights for ArcGIS Online is going to be released very soon. So sometime this month or early next year, you will be able to use it with ArcGIS Online. I believe that's actually going to be with this month's update. The other option is to install it locally on your portal for ArcGIS Enterprise instance. And it would act as an application. So you will have the ability to access it both ways depending on what works best for your organization.
Thanks, Derek. Another question we have is concerning the file size. Is there a limit or a number of records that are limited for adding your CBS or Excel data?
So the limits are all around the amount of features that will draw, just like any other normal ArcGIS service. But in terms of the file size, I don't know if there is a particular hard cap on it. I was using 5.9 million consumption records from White House Utility District, and I have personally used data sets up to about 8 million records. I think the biggest indicator of whether or not you'll be able to use those large files is the amount of processing and RAM available to your instance of Insights for ArcGIS.
Thanks. Another question we have concerns relationships. Can you have more than 2 data sets or files in a relationship?
Yes, you can. You can connect multiple tables to geographic features or tables to tables through the relationship view. You aren't limited to just a single relationship between 2 data sets or tables.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is about your geography source. I know you guys discussed this towards the end of the webinar. Is it possible to use a route event as your source?
So you can use any source that is a feature class stored inside of your data store. So if you create a route and stops inside of something like Network Analyst or ArcGIS Align and put that data inside of your data store as a feature layer, then you should be able to access it inside of Insights.
Great, thank you. So going back to the ArcGIS Online version that we're hoping to have by the end of the year or early next year, do you know if that's going to have the full tool set, or is there going to be incremental updates to get it to the full version that we have now on Portal?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? You kind of phased out right in the beginning of the question.
Sorry, Derek. Just a clarification as far as the Insights for ArcGIS coming to ArcGIS Online, are we expecting to have a full tool set available in ArcGIS Online, or is this going to be incrementally added?
I don't know the answer to that question, but we can check with the development team and get that answer out.
Great, thanks. And to Derek's point, we will be posting these questions with answers on GeoNet. So take a look at that in about a week, and we'll have more detailed answers on some of these that we don't know right now. The next question we have concerns the cards that you're using in Insights for ArcGIS. Do you know if there are plans to allow these cards to be exported to Story Map or to have Insights data in general used in Story Maps?
So I know right now you can actually share a page in its entirety for use in a story map. In terms of individual cards, I do not know if that's on the roadmap or not, but we can add that to the list of questions that we asked the dev team.
Awesome. So we just have a couple more. This one I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I want to know about customization of your maps and charts in Insights. Can you set that to be a standard where there's a default color scheme, or is this something you need to do as you build them?
So there's essentially 2 ways you can do that. You can change the colors of your maps and things like that when you are creating them. The charts you cannot set a standard color for, but if you do load data into your data store with a particular symbology, it will be carried through into Insights when you add that data.
Thanks. Another question we have is about the licensing. Is this something that's going to be licensed per user? Is it included with your enterprise agreement? Can you give some information about licensing and how that will work for our customers?
Yeah, so Insights is a per user license in ArcGIS Portal or ArcGIS Align that requires a Insights license and access to a level 2 named user. And in terms of access to that through an enterprise license agreement, if your enterprise license agreement was signed or instituted before, I believe December of 2016, there will be a set number of Insights licenses apportioned to that enterprise agreement. So in that instance, to use those, you would just need to talk to your account executive or manager.
Thanks, Derek. It was a great webinar today. Matt, Derek, thank you for presenting. I hope our customers found the information useful. So if you guys have any other questions that you'd like to send in, you can email me at any time. And as I mentioned, we will answer these questions and get them posted on GeoNet for your future reference. Thank you for joining our webinar. I hope you have a great day.